Putin's Iron Curtain. Russia has slammed its borders shut. General mobilization is just around the corner. NATO has come right up to Russia's borders. The alliance is encircling the Russian world. Panic is off the charts. The Kremlin has launched an information offensive. A new scheme has been uncovered in the Baltic countries. A loud failure for Russian propaganda. Estonia has responded harshly to the actions of Putin's henchmen. I'll tell you all the details in just a moment. Greetings, this is the Ukraine Today channel. Andrei Silikov and the latest events. A major offensive against NATO. Russia is closing railway border crossings with alliance countries. Who will set off the first explosion? NATO taunts Putin in response. The alliance has opened a new headquarters near Russia's borders, and Russians have trolled the advisor to the president of Estonia. Putin is putting on a show of fake strength to pull the wool over people's eyes. Russia is slamming down the Iron Curtain. The Kremlin is urgently shutting down border crossings with Finland, Latvia, and Estonia. Starting July 1st, the Russian government has decided to temporarily halt movement through several railway checkpoints, increasing tensions along the country's northwestern borders.
To temporarily suspend, starting July 1st, 2026, the movement of people, vehicles, goods, and cargo through railway checkpoints across certain sections of the state border of the Russian Federation, in accordance with the list provided in the appendix.
The most significant blow was dealt to the border with Finland. The railway hubs of Vyborg, Vartselia, Lutia, St. Petersburg, Finlyanski, and Svetogorsk have been affected by the blockade. All traffic is completely halted at the Russian-Estonian Pechery-Pskov border crossing point, as well as at the border with Latvia, where the Pechery-Pskov crossing point ceases operations. Pitalovo. The Russian Foreign Ministry has already been instructed to notify Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. At the same time, the Kremlin remains persistently silent about the reasons for this decision. Could this really be preparation for a new wave of mobilization due to the enormous losses in the war against Ukraine? And what do you think? Write your opinion in the comments. While the Kremlin is closing the borders, NATO is making a countermove. The alliance is opening a new military headquarters near Russia's borders. Military presence on the eastern flank is being strengthened. NATO has come right up to Russia's borders. The alliance is launching a new command center just a few kilometers from the Russian border. The headquarters was established in the Estonian city of Valga, near the Latvian border. The new headquarters will become the brain center of the alliance's eastern flank. It is from here that NATO units stationed in Estonia and Latvia, as well as the national ground forces of both countries, will be commanded. Large-scale military exercises will be planned here. They will coordinate troop preparations and develop defense scenarios for the region in case of possible Russian aggression. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius stated that the launch of the new command center will be a powerful boost to defensive capabilities. NATO will also significantly strengthen the alliance's position on the Eastern Front.
By adding another highly effective headquarters on NATO's eastern flank, we are increasing our readiness, strengthening our command and control structures, and enhancing our ability to deter any potential adversary.
NATO Land Forces Commander General Christopher Donahue noted that European allies are now taking the greatest responsibility for their own security in the past 35 years. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is trying to engage in information provocations. Pro-Kremlin pranksters called the Estonian president's security advisor pro-Kremlin pranksters. Russian propaganda channels claim that Vovan and Lexus allegedly pranked Mattis Roll. The Estonian president's office stated that no classified information was disclosed. And the current publication by Russian media only misleads the audience.
I said that we understand. Ukraine is at war, and the responsibility for such incidents lies with Russia, which started the aggression against Ukraine. When I spoke about helping Ukraine, it was solely in the context of what kind of cooperation Estonia and Ukraine could establish to prevent drones from entering Estonian territory. Here, Russian propaganda has arbitrarily distorted reality.
Estonia stated that this is far from being an isolated attack. The presidential office reported that similar calls attempting to extract information were also received by representatives of other Baltic countries. Moreover, Ukraine had previously issued public warnings about such provocations. It seems the Kremlin continues its information hunt far beyond Russia's borders. Russian propaganda media are trying to turn this conversation into a major information sensation. According to their version, during the conversation, which allegedly took place on June 1st, Maris Roll supposedly stated that Estonia fully supports Ukraine and is ready to assist in coordinating strikes on St. Petersburg. In addition, Russian sources claim that he confirmed cooperation between Estonian and Ukrainian officials on this issue. Propagandists attribute similar statements to the advisor to the president of Lithuania, Dovydas Matulionis, who, according to them, also confirmed unconditional support for Ukraine and refused to criticize Kyiv. However, the office of the president of Estonia made it clear that the very fact that Russia is trying to pass off an ordinary scam call as a major political exposé speaks volumes about the methods of Kremlin propaganda.
When such staged exposés are presented as achievements, it is more a sign of desperation than of strength. This does not change the real state of affairs and does not lessen Russia's responsibility for its aggressive war against Ukraine.
Meanwhile, Ukraine is launching a large-scale rearmament of its army, ramping up its own production of the latest systems and receiving increasingly powerful support from its allies. What the Kremlin once called demilitarization is, in practice, turning into a rapid strengthening of Ukraine's defense capabilities. And new developments in air defense, drones, and combat aviation are increasingly beginning to resemble the foundation of a new security architecture. Not just for Ukraine, but for all of Europe. All the most interesting details are in the next segment. Don't miss it. Ukraine's defense industry is soaring to new heights. Dark times are coming for Russian Shaheds. While the Kremlin is busy calculating how many more hundreds of drones they can launch at Ukrainian cities, Ukraine has already unveiled its response. A new generation. The Zirka interceptor drone looks like the next step forward, toward the moment when massive attacks will no longer be an effective weapon for Moscow. A speed of over 340 kilometers per hour, automatic target detection, and the ability to literally hunt down aerial threats. And this is just the beginning. Engineers are already working on the Zirka 2.0, which will be able to independently enter the search area. It will acquire the latest machine vision systems and even more autonomous guidance. If these plans are implemented on the necessary scale, Russia risks facing a reality in which its cheapest tool of terror suddenly stops working. And this means that the entire strategy of exhausting Ukraine's air defense will start to fall apart at the seams. At the same time, Ukraine is showcasing increasingly ambitious developments that until recently seemed like science fiction. The Mobydick maritime drone, with a range of up to 1,400 kilometers and capable of carrying other long-range drones and missile drones, looks like a claim to an entirely new class of weaponry. And while Russian propaganda keeps talking about having no analogues, the Ukrainian defense sector is increasingly showcasing developments for which Moscow so far has no ready answer. Moreover, Kyiv has announced new agreements with partners to strengthen air defense. Particularly noteworthy is that this involves not only cooperation with individual countries, but also coordination between the US and European allies.
There are things we can do additionally within the framework of cooperation at the level between the United States and European countries.
This is not about one-time assistance, but about creating a new system of interaction among allies. Partners are looking for ways to make Ukraine's air defense even more effective, and Russian air attacks even less successful. Ukraine is not simply strengthening its air defense. An entire ecosystem of new means of protection and strike capabilities is being formed. If earlier Russia tried to intimidate Ukraine with the number of drones and missiles, now it is unclear whether the Kremlin itself has enough resources to keep up with the technological race it is beginning to lose. And it seems that this is only the beginning of a major rearmament. Ukraine is officially launching one of the largest Air Force modernization projects in its entire history of independence. An agreement has been signed for the delivery of 16 Swedish JAS-39 Gripen E fighter jets. These aircraft are called by many military experts some of the most dangerous hunters in the modern sky. And while the Kremlin continues to threaten the world as usual, Europe is effectively helping Ukraine build a new generation air shield. This is not about a routine replenishment of the aircraft fleet. The Gripen E is equipped with a powerful next-generation radar, advanced electronic warfare systems, and Meteor missiles capable of hitting targets at distances of over 100 kilometers. In simple terms, Russian aircraft, cruise missiles, and attack drones will face extremely tough challenges. And the further things go, the harder it becomes to ignore the obvious. Ukraine is no longer just defending itself. Ukraine is shaping a new architecture for the protection of its skies, where its own innovations, Western technologies, and strategic agreements are beginning to function as a single mechanism. If just yesterday the Kremlin dreamed of air supremacy, today it is increasingly forced to consider how to operate in skies that are rapidly becoming ever more dangerous for Russian aviation. Meanwhile, while Russian propaganda is convincing the population that the West is about to get tired of Ukraine, the United Kingdom announces a new support package worth almost £290 million. And this has long ceased to look like temporary aid. Since the start of the full-scale war, London has allocated more than £21 billion to Ukraine. The amount is so impressive that on Russian television screens they prefer, once again, not to mention it. During the negotiations in Kiev, the parties discussed not only the front and preparations for the upcoming NATO summit, but also the consequences of Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. And it seems that these consequences are becoming increasingly painful. Fuel shortages, logistical problems, and a shift in sentiment within Russian society can no longer be hidden, even behind the usual propaganda scenery.
It is important that our partners are noting Ukraine's successes on the front line, the results of our mid-range and deep strikes. We discussed the situation on the battlefield in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, particularly in Crimea as well as in Russia, fuel shortages and changing public sentiment.
In fact, we are witnessing a new stage of cooperation between Ukraine and its allies. The West is increasingly less likely to speak only about containing Russia. Instead, more and more often, we hear assessments of specific Ukrainian successes and concrete decisions being made to further strengthen Ukraine. And for the Kremlin, this is probably one of the most unpleasant pieces of news. After all, the bet on isolating Ukraine is currently working, in fact, quite the opposite. While the Kremlin continues to draw maps of future victories, reality keeps throwing more and more unpleasant surprises at Moscow. The Ukrainian army is not only holding the front, but is also reclaiming its territories. Russian air defense is increasingly losing its eyes, opening the way for new strikes deep inside the country. And Ukrainian missiles are increasingly turning into a real nightmare for military facilities that, until recently, were considered untouchable. It seems that the main outcome of this war is becoming harder and harder to hide, even in the Kremlin offices. Details in the report. It appears that Moscow has trapped itself in the snare of its own ambitions. The war that was supposed to break Ukraine has instead turned it into one of the most capable armies on the continent. The Ukrainian army has not only held out but continues to liberate territories. According to the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, since the beginning of the year, the defense forces have regained control over more than 670 square kilometers of Ukrainian land. And in May, Ukrainian forces actually managed to reclaim more territory than they lost. And the greatest paradox is that it was Russia itself that accelerated this strengthening. For years, the Kremlin spoke about the demilitarization of Ukraine, but the result turned out to be exactly the opposite. Ukraine has received modern weaponry, invaluable combat experience, new technologies, and one of the most effective armies in Europe. What was supposed to destroy Ukraine's defenses has actually turned into the largest program to strengthen them. The very force Moscow planned to keep far from its own borders is now gradually shifting onto Russian territory itself. According to Sirovatko, Ukraine's long-range campaign has already seriously affected the enemy's capabilities. Strikes on military targets, logistics, and the defense industry have prevented the occupiers from reaching even their planned production volumes of Shaheds. As a result, the factories that were supposed to supply new attacks on Ukraine are themselves increasingly becoming part of the front line. And it seems that in the Kremlin, they prefer not to report this any more than necessary. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine stated that the Russian leadership continues to hide from Putin the loss of certain territories, the isolation of Crimea, and the consequences of strikes on military enterprises. As a result, the country that calls itself a superpower is increasingly forced to conceal from its own leadership what is happening within its borders, right under their noses. Despite shifting the economy onto a war footing and constantly ramping up arms production, Moscow has still not achieved the desired result. That is why there is increasing talk about a new wave of mobilization and searching for a way out of a situation that has dragged on for too long. Because while the Kremlin continues to draw up maps of future offensives, the reality looks quite different. Ukrainian forces are not only holding back the enemy, but are also gradually reclaiming their land, while simultaneously creating problems for the Russian army behind the front lines. It turns out to be symbolic. Moscow wanted to weaken Ukraine, but in the end got a stronger Ukrainian army and a war that is increasingly making itself felt, even on Russian territory. Meanwhile, yet another supposedly impenetrable Russian defense has fallen to the Ukrainian armed forces. While Kremlin propaganda talks about the world's most dense air defense system, Ukrainian forces are increasingly disproving this lie. We're no longer talking about isolated successful strikes, but about systematic efforts to destroy key elements of Russia's air defense. According to data from unmanned systems forces, operators of the Roni group regularly disable radars in the Bryansk region. These radars control the skies in the direction of Moscow. Simply put, the Russian system is losing its eyes precisely where they are needed most. And when the radar stops seeing the airspace, even the most expensive air defense systems start to work less effectively. And it seems that the consequences are already being felt far beyond the Bryansk region. It is precisely through such gaps in the defense that Ukrainian long-range drones are increasingly making their way to targets that until recently were considered almost unreachable. St. Petersburg, Ust-Luga, Moscow. The list of targets is gradually expanding, and with it, the number of uncomfortable questions for Russian generals is also growing.
The breached Russian air defense is not a social media fabrication and not a coincidence. When the enemy loses its eyes, the sky opens up for our long-range strikes.
Operation Polyphemus showed that it is not enough to simply place radars and air defense systems on the map. If the key elements of this system are systematically taken out of action, corridors appear in the defensive shield through which strikes begin to get through. And it seems that closing this gap over Moscow will be much harder for the Russian command than explaining its existence on television broadcasts. It's hard to forget. And there's another nightmare haunting the Kremlin at night, and its name is Flamingo. Ukrainian missiles are appearing in the sky more and more often, and just a few seconds later, explosions hit targets that only yesterday were considered reliably protected. The footage of the strike on the Titan Barricades military facility, which appeared online, turned out to be especially telling. In the video, you can clearly see not only the flight of the Ukrainian FP-5 missile itself, but also the reaction of the Russian, who almost immediately recognizes the outline of what is approaching. And in this reaction, perhaps, there is more truth about the current situation than in dozens of official statements from the Russian Ministry of Defense. It's not just about an impressive image, but about very real consequences. According to available data, the explosions literally scorched the production facilities from the inside. Another
bastard.
For a military facility, this means much more than just damaged walls or a roof. Technological lines, equipment, communications, and the ability to quickly return to normal operations are being destroyed. The plant continues to exist on the map, but it can no longer operate as it did before. And it seems that this is only the beginning, because each new flight of a Ukrainian missile over Russian territory serves as a reminder of the main outcome of this whole story. Putin wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, but in the end, he got a country of engineers, military personnel, and developers of the latest weapon systems. And now it is precisely these developments that are increasingly arriving in places where people were once certain that the war would never touch them. Alarming signals are sounding louder and louder in the Kremlin. Those closest to Putin among the economic elite are now openly talking about the need to end the war. Meanwhile, Russians themselves are searching for information about bomb shelters, drones, and the end of the special military operation at record rates. While Ukrainian technologies are ushering in a new phase of the war, more and more people in Russia are beginning to ask a question that the Kremlin has long been unwilling to answer. All the details are in our report. In the Kremlin, what Putin fears most is being voiced more and more often. Talks about ending the war. And this time it wasn't an opposition figure, an independent expert, or even a Western politician who brought it up. The head of Russia's largest bank, Hermann Greff, publicly stated the need to end the war as soon as possible. A man who for many years has been part of the Russian president's closest economic circle. Greff has essentially admitted what people in Moscow are increasingly whispering about.
I don't think there's anyone in the country who has any other concerns besides ending the military actions as soon as possible. And
if the head of Sberbank allows himself to make such statements publicly, it may indicate much deeper sentiments within the Russian elite. The reaction to this statement turned out to be even more telling. The message with the quote almost immediately disappeared from information resources and then just as unexpectedly reappeared. It seems that in Moscow they can no longer even decide which signals are allowed to be sent to society and which are not. When does a country start nervously editing the words of one of its most influential officials? Literally just a few minutes after publication, this usually indicates internal tension. And it seems that this is exactly where the most dangerous trend for a dictator begins to take shape. Because when talk of ending the war begins, it's not ordinary citizens, but people from the closest economic circles of power. This means that discontent is gradually rising higher and higher. And history has shown more than once. For authoritarian regimes, the hardest times begin. Not when society gets tired, but when their own inner circle does. But ordinary Russians are also gradually stopping their game of silence. According to Russian search statistics, the query, "When will the special military operation end?" has set an absolute record for the entire duration of the war. In just 1 week, Russians searched for the answer to this question more than 137,000 times. And what is especially telling is that this surge coincided with two particularly painful problems for the Kremlin: the fuel crisis and a series of large-scale drone attacks on Russian territory. Russians began to feel the war when gasoline prices started to rise. When oil depots are burning and drones are increasingly reaching Russian regions, distant events at the front suddenly turn into a very personal problem. And then, instead of searching for news about the army's latest successes, people start looking for the date the war will end. Another statistic looks even more interesting. In Moscow and the Moscow region, the number of searches about bomb shelters has sharply increased. In a year and a half, interest in this topic has increased by more than threefold. It seems that stories about a completely protected Russian sky are holding up worse and worse. A collision with reality. And the real leader has become the query for UAVs. Over the same period, interest in drones in the capital region has grown almost fivefold. And this perhaps is the best illustration of how Russian reality has changed. If earlier drones were a topic for military reports, now they have become part of everyday life for millions of Russians. And it seems that Russians will have to get used to this topic, because in Kyiv they are already openly talking about the beginning of a new technological stage of the war. If earlier such operations were perceived as isolated successes, now they increasingly resemble a systematic campaign based on new capabilities of Ukrainian unmanned systems. According to Mikhailo Fedorov, it is precisely Ukraine's technological breakthrough that has made it possible to strike military targets and the occupiers' logistics in Crimea. We're no longer just talking about isolated attacks, but about new tools that make it possible to reach targets at significant distances and gradually destroy the military infrastructure that underpins the Russian presence in the occupied territories. The minister made it clear that Ukraine does not intend to stop at what has been achieved. On the contrary, the capabilities of such operations are growing every day, and new technologies are enabling increasingly effective actions. And what is especially unpleasant for the Kremlin? It's no longer just about the occupied Crimea. In fact, Moscow is getting exactly what it tried hardest to avoid. For years, Putin convinced people that the war was necessary for Russia's security. But the longer it goes on, the more often Russians are searching online. Not news about victory, but addresses, bomb shelters, information about drones, and answers to the question of when all this will end. The war that Moscow planned to keep as far away from its own population as possible is gradually returning to Russia itself. And the more often drones appear over Russian cities and new price tags show up at gas stations, the louder becomes the question that until recently was considered undesirable. When finally will the special military operation end? What do you think about the latest events? We look forward to your comments. There's more to come. Stay up to date with the main news and don't forget to like. Wishing you peaceful skies overhead.